Okay, since my thoughts are never cohesive on these recordings, I figured I'd write down my thoughts down to at least be a little more interesting instead of the mindless droning of a monotone body. Alright, I'm reading this right now, by the way. Okay, so what do I want to talk about? I'm not too sure right now, but let's say life in general, okay? Okay, sounds good to me. How about my life? And me. Why not? So, I was born in 1982, which makes me a child growing up in the classical cartoon age. Smurfs, the Snorks, and other weird sounding shows that which have made up creatures. And there's the Looney Tunes and other classic cartoon reruns and remakes. And then there's He-Man, which was one of my favorites. I used to hold up a plastic sword and say, "By the power of Grayskull," and run around in my underwear. Yeah, that I'm not reading. That's just one of my thoughts. Okay. Transformers, G.I. Joe. Basically all the cartoons that were ever redone and cartoons that ended up being redone later on just because it had to happen. They were just good shows. Alright, so what does that make me? Honestly, being born in a certain decade almost makes you seem aware of the funny fashion and the problems in that decade, because as a kid I think you're a little more perceptive and maybe a little more open to question everything that's happening around you. But as you get older, you become a little more accepting and more involved in the world around you. So my life actually was more based around the 90s, which they were just as funny and messed up and ridiculous as the 80s, but I'm sorry, the pop music of the 90s was a lot better than the 80s junk. No offense to all you Madonna and Michael Jackson fans, or I don't know. So how does this really matter? What does it mean? Well, something I heard when I was growing up was decades repeat themselves. Basically, history repeats itself. I looked back to the 70s and I was like, that shit's awesome. Excuse my language. But I abhorred the 80s. So what does that mean to me? It means when the 90s come back and into style, I'll be an aging slacker, if that makes sense. There'll be kids listening to bands like Sublime, Nirvana, maybe even some of the one-hit wonders during the 90s. Who knows, right? Now, just a quick question. Like, did this always happen? Or the people in the 1920s looking back at the turn of the century and being like, man, those were the times? Or is it just a recent thing that's happening? Well, I don't know, honestly. It does seem like history repeats itself. And supposedly the cure for that, history repeating itself, is educating yourself about history so that it doesn't repeat itself. But really, something will always happen and happen again later, right? What I'm saying is nothing is new is going to happen, especially when we try to relive the past like we've been doing with the 80s and the 90s and everything. I just lost my screen. So, let me get back to where I was. Alright. Weird idea, but how about this? Figure out a way to do something new and try it once today. Now, it doesn't have to be a style, form of music, or whatever you associate with, but why not an idea? Like, did some people worship art back in the day as they seem to worship video games today? Something, just to try and put something into words that hasn't, just try and think of something that hasn't been put into words and hasn't been thought of before. Try and share it with the world. Well, I guess that's about it for right now, but if you guys try that stuff, I'll try keep on recording stuff like this.